Family Guy is remembered as a family sitcom built for cheap laughs and shock value. People assume the characters are simple jokes, drawn quick and forgotten fast. But one former staff writer claims the show's real history sits closer to accident than design. What happened behind these voices was never supposed to reach an audience at all. These are every Family Guy character's hidden secrets. Peter Griffin. The voice was a real man he mocked. Peter Griffin has one of the most recognized voices in modern television. The moment he opens his mouth, almost anyone who has ever watched an episode of Family Guy knows exactly who is talking. It is loud, a little nasal, filled with strange pauses, and somehow dumb and confident at the same time. People have imitated it for over 20 years. It has shown up in parody videos, in classrooms, in car rides, in late-night conversations between friends trying to make each other laugh. Almost nobody who does that impression realizes they are, in a roundabout way, imitating someone who once existed in real life. Not a famous person, not an actor, not anyone with their name attached to the show at all. Just a man who worked as a security guard. Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy and the man who provides Peter's voice, has said in interviews that Peter's voice was based on a security guard who worked at the college he attended. MacFarlane studied at the Rhode Island School of Design, a small and well-known art school on the East Coast, where he trained to become an animator long before Family Guy existed. Rhode Island School of Design has produced generations of artists, illustrators, and designers, and it is known for pushing students hard, expecting long hours in the studio, and a level of discipline that goes far beyond casual hobby drawing. MacFarlane was not simply passing through. He was there to learn the actual mechanics of animation, the timing, the movement, the way a drawn character has to hold a personality across dozens of frames a second. While he was there, going to classes, working on drawings, learning the basics of character design and storytelling, there was a security guard on campus whose way of speaking stuck with him. According to MacFarlane, he and his friends found the way this man talked to be funny. Something about his tone, or his rhythm, or the way he phrased things struck them as hard not to laugh at. They were young students at the time, the kind of age where things like this become inside jokes that get repeated for months. At some point, MacFarlane must have started doing an impression of him, the way people do when someone's voice becomes a running joke among friends. Most of the time, that would be where a story like this ends. A funny voice, shared between classmates, forgotten within a year or two once everyone graduates and moves on with their lives. People imitate teachers, co-workers, bus drivers, and neighbors all the time. It is one of the most ordinary things people do. College campuses in particular tend to be full of these small, temporary legends. A professor with an odd verbal habit, a cafeteria worker with a memorable way of calling out order numbers, a security guard who says the same 3 phrases every single day on his rounds. Usually the impression fades quietly, remembered only by the small group of friends who were there for it, brought up maybe once or twice at a reunion years later, and then forgotten again. But this one did not fade. Instead, it became part of one of the most watched cartoons in the history of American television, spoken by a father figure with slouched shoulders and a doughy face, who mostly makes bad decisions and somehow always survives them. To understand how that jump happened, it helps to think about who Seth MacFarlane actually was during those college years, and what he was doing with his time. He was not just an amateur cartoonist making doodles between classes. Rhode Island School of Design is a serious and demanding art school, and MacFarlane was there to work on animation as a real craft, the same way someone studying music might spend hours a day on scales and technique long before ever writing a full song. While attending, he made a set of short animated films that most casual fans of the show have never heard of. One was called Life of Larry, and a small sequel of sorts was called Larry and Steve. These shorts featured a tired, overweight, middle-aged man named Larry and a much smarter dog who lived with him named Steve. Larry was not clever. He struggled through daily life in a way that was meant to be funny rather than sad, stumbling through small disasters while his dog looked on with far more patience than Larry seemed to deserve. These were student projects, made with the kind of limited time and limited resources that any young animator working on a school assignment would have had. Nothing close to the budget or polish of a professional television production. And yet something about the pairing clearly worked, because MacFarlane kept returning to it. If that description already sounds familiar, that is because it should. A slow, overweight, well-meaning but foolish man, paired with a far more intelligent talking dog who often seems embarrassed by him, is essentially the emotional shape of Peter Griffin and Brian long before either of those two characters had those names. MacFarlane made these shorts while he was still a student, well before any network was involved, well before there was a show called Family Guy at all. They were personal projects, something closer to a young animator testing out a voice and a sense of humor to see what stuck, the kind of early experiment that most artists go through quietly before anyone outside their small circle ever sees the results. It turned out that this pairing of a foolish man and his smarter dog was something people responded to. because those student films are part of what eventually caught the attention of a major television network. It is worth remembering that at the time McFarlane was making these shorts, he had no way of knowing whether any of it would ever be seen beyond his classmates and professors. He was simply following an idea that amused him, refining a joke that had started as nothing more than a private impression of someone he had encountered on campus. After McFarlane finished school, his path led him toward Hanna-Barbera, one of the biggest animation studios in American history, the studio behind classics like The Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, and The Jetsons. Working at a studio with that kind of history meant being surrounded by decades of animation tradition, learning from people who had helped shape what American cartoons looked like for generations of viewers. He worked there as an animator and writer, building skills that would matter a great deal later on, absorbing the practical, day-to-day discipline of turning ideas into finished episodes on a schedule, something very different from the freedom of working on a personal student film with no real deadline attached. He did not forget about Larry, the dim-witted man from his student films, or the security guard voice that had stuck with him back at school. Those two things, a character built years earlier and a voice borrowed from an ordinary man on campus, sat quietly in the background of everything McFarlane worked on next, waiting for the right opportunity to come together into something bigger. When the chance eventually came to pitch a new show to a television network, it was that same rough sketch of a character, part Larry, part real-life security guard impression, that formed the seed of what would grow into Peter Griffin. It helps to sit with just how unusual this is. Most cartoon characters get built the other way around. A network wants a show about a family, so writers sit in a room and invent a father figure from nothing, giving him a job, a personality, a catchphrase, and a voice that fits some idea of what a sitcom dad should sound like. In that more typical process, the voice usually comes last, chosen almost like a costume fitted onto a character who has already been fully written on paper. Peter Griffin came from the opposite direction entirely. The voice existed first, as a real human being's actual speech pattern, remembered and repeated by a group of college students who found it funny. A rough personality got attached to that voice through a short student film made years before any network ever got involved. Only after all of that did Peter Griffin, in the shape fans now know, get built around it, given a wife, 3 kids, a dog, a job at a brewery, and a whole fictional town called Quahog to live in. The entire process ran backward compared to how most animated characters usually come together, starting with a sound rather than ending with one. Every time Peter Griffin says something ridiculous on screen, every time he trails off in the middle of a sentence, or laughs in that strange way of his, there is a small, quiet echo running underneath it back to a real security guard who almost certainly has no idea that his voice became the foundation for one of the most famous cartoon characters on television. He was not consulted. He was not credited. He likely never agreed to any of this, because there was nothing to agree to at the time. He was simply a man doing his job on a college campus, unaware that a group of art students found the way he spoke amusing enough to remember for years. There is no indication that this man was ever tracked down later, once the show became successful, to be told what had happened, or to be thanked, or even to be informed. He most likely lived his life entirely unaware that somewhere, on television screens across the country, a version of his own voice was making millions of people laugh every week. The path from that college campus to a television network was not quick or easy either. Long before Family Guy became a hit, McFarlane pitched the idea to Fox, around the same time that another animated show, King of the Hill, was being finalized with a different creator. Fox already had one new adult cartoon in the works and was hesitant to add a second one so close behind it, so they passed on McFarlane's idea the first time he brought it forward. Most people would have let that be the end of it. A rejection from a major network is the kind of thing that ends plenty of careers in development before they ever really begin, and there would have been nothing unusual about McFarlane simply moving on to other work after hearing no. Instead, McFarlane came back about a year later and tried again. By that point, King of the Hill had done well enough that Fox was willing to take another chance on an animated family show, and they gave McFarlane a modest budget to put together a pilot. That pilot became the seed of everything that followed, built around a voice that had started years earlier as a private joke shared between college friends about a man neither McFarlane nor his classmates likely ever spoke to directly. There is another small piece of this story that fans sometimes overlook, which is how many other characters share a voice with Peter without most viewers noticing right away. Seth MacFarlane does not only voice Peter, he also voices Stewie, Brian, and Glenn Quagmire, switching between these very different characters often within the same scene, sometimes within the same few seconds of dialogue. This means the actual physical voice underneath Peter's gravelly, nasal tone belongs to the same person delivering Stewie's sharp, upper-class British accent moments later, and then shifting again into Quagmire's rapid, old-fashioned radio announcer style right after that. It takes real vocal control to jump between these voices cleanly enough that most viewers never stop to think they are listening to one man the entire time. Recording sessions built around scenes where several of these characters talk to each other must require an unusual kind of focus, since McFarlane effectively has to keep track of 4 separate performances at once, making sure none of them start blending into each other even slightly while switching back and forth line by line. Peter's voice, strange as its true origin might be, is only one piece of a much larger performance McFarlane repeats episode after episode, year after year. Knowing where Peter's voice came from changes the character a little, even if only in a quiet way. Peter Griffin is often treated as a symbol of a certain kind of clueless, overgrown man-child, someone whose bad decisions and lack of self-awareness are meant to be laughed at without much thought given to where any of it came from. Understanding that his voice began as an impression of an actual person, someone with a real life and a real job who never signed up to become part of a joke, adds a strange layer underneath all of that laughter. It does not ruin the character or make him any less funny. If anything, it makes Peter feel a little more grounded in something real, even if that reality is small, uncredited, and mostly invisible unless someone happens to go looking for it the way we just did. There is a strange kind of humility sitting inside this fact as well, a reminder that even one of the loudest, most exaggerated characters on modern television did not spring from pure invention. He started with a real sound made by a real person going about an ordinary day. This kind of quiet secret sits underneath many characters on this show, and once you start looking for them, they turn up in places you would never expect. Some come from real people that the writers knew personally. Some come from actors making bold choices during auditions that nobody planned for ahead of time. Some come from ideas that almost never made it to screen at all, and only survived because someone refused to let them go. Peter's voice happens to be one of the more human ones, since it began with real laughter shared between friends who probably never imagined any of it would end up on television. It stands as a small reminder that long-running shows are rarely built from a single grand plan sitting fully formed at the very beginning. They tend to be assembled slowly, out of scraps, private jokes, half-remembered impressions, and small decisions made by young people who had no idea at the time how far any of it would eventually travel. There is one more small detail worth sitting with before we move on. Once Family Guy became successful, it would have been simple enough for McFarlane to smooth over this part of Peter's history, to let people assume the voice had simply been invented from nothing, the way most fictional voices are. Instead, he has mentioned it in interviews more than once, almost treating it as an ordinary piece of trivia rather than something worth hiding. That casualness says something about how these things tend to work behind the scenes of a long-running show. The starting point for a character who has now lasted more than 20 years on air was not some careful writer's room decision. It was a small, private joke between college students, remembered just long enough to end up shaping one of the most famous voices in television history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Right next door to Peter, married to him for over 2 decades on screen, is a woman whose own background holds a secret far bigger than a single voice. Where Peter's story began with a joke between friends, hers begins with money, a hidden past, and a family fortune that shaped who she became long before she ever met the man she would marry. Section 2. Lois Griffin. Old money, hidden faith. Lois Griffin is usually seen as the steady one in the Griffin household. She is the mother who tries to hold the family together while everyone around her causes chaos. She cooks the meals, cleans the house, breaks up fights between her children, and somehow puts up with a husband who rarely thinks before he acts. On the surface, she looks like a fairly simple character, a patient wife and mother built to react to everyone else's nonsense. But underneath that calm surface sits one of the richest, strangest backstories of any character on the show, built from real family wealth, a hidden religious identity, a missing sibling turned criminal, and a voice that almost sounded completely different from the one fans know today. To understand Lois properly, it helps to start with where she actually came from, because it is not where most viewers assume. Lois was not born into an ordinary household. She was born Lois Pewterschmidt, the daughter of an extremely wealthy family. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is shown throughout the show as a rich, controlling man who looks down on Peter at almost every opportunity, making comments that remind everyone just how far beneath the family Peter is seen to be. Her mother, Barbara Pewterschmidt, comes from that same world of money and old family standing. Lois did not grow up worrying about rent or groceries the way most families do. She grew up in comfort, surrounded by wealth that most people never experience, in a household defined by status, appearances, and money that had been in the family for generations. Think for a moment about what a childhood like that would actually look like day to day. A house full of staff, instead of one tired parent doing everything alone. Trips and vacations planned without anyone worrying about the cost. Private schools instead of crowded public ones. Family dinners that come with rules about posture and table manners rather than someone just yelling to sit down and eat before the food goes cold. That is the world Lois came from. A world built around comfort so total that most of its everyday problems would look completely unfamiliar to a family like the Griffins living on Spooner Street. It is a strange thing to picture. The same woman who now spends her afternoons managing Stewie's tantrums and Peter's messes, once living inside a house where none of those problems would have even registered as real problems at all. This detail alone reshapes how Lois should be understood by anyone watching the show closely. She is not simply a mother who happens to live in a modest house on Spooner Street with her husband and 3 kids. She is someone who left behind an entire world of privilege and family fortune to build a very different kind of life. Marrying Peter Griffin, a man with none of that background, none of that money, and very little of the polish that comes from being raised around it, was in many ways a complete departure from the life she was raised to expect. That gap between where Lois came from and where she ended up says quite a lot about her, even if the show rarely stops to explore it directly. Underneath the sitcom chaos sits a woman who chose an ordinary, sometimes embarrassing life over the wealthy one she was handed at birth. It is worth asking what that choice actually says about her as a person. Plenty of people raised with money stay close to it their whole lives, marrying into similar circles, keeping the same comfortable distance from ordinary struggles that they grew up with. Lois did the opposite. She built a life with a man who works at a brewery, who struggles constantly with money, and who embarrasses her regularly in front of people who matter to her family. Whatever pulled her toward Peter in the first place, it was strong enough to override an entire lifetime of expectations built around marrying someone from her own social world. That is not a small decision. It is the kind of decision that tends to create lasting tension with a family used to controlling every part of a daughter's future. And the show gives small hints of exactly that kind of tension every time Carter Pewterschmidt makes another dismissive comment about his son-in-law. Lois did not grow up as an only child either. She has a sister named Carol, who appears in the show from time to time, tied to that same wealthy Pewterschmidt background. But Lois also has another sibling who rarely comes up in casual conversation about the show, a brother named Patrick. According to the show itself, Patrick is described as a long-lost older brother who was sent to a mental institution after becoming a serial killer. This is a strange detail to sit with, especially next to the image most people have of Lois as the reasonable, grounded member of her own family. Her father is short-tempered and dismissive. Her brother became a killer serious enough to be locked away. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Lois turned out to be the one relatively stable person to come out of the Pewterschmidt household, the one who chose a small, ordinary life over the enormous, complicated shadow cast by her own family name. It is worth sitting with how strange it would be to grow up knowing you have a brother capable of something that serious, someone locked away and rarely spoken about, while everyone around you continues living as though the family is simply a wealthy, respectable one with nothing dark hiding inside it. Families built around image and status often handle this kind of situation the same way, quietly removing the uncomfortable pieces from conversation rather than confronting them directly. Whatever the full story behind Patrick's path from a member of that same household to someone locked away for serious crimes, the fact that Lois grew up alongside him in that same wealthy home adds a layer of darkness to a family the show usually presents through comedy rather than anything genuinely troubling. The story of how Lois met Peter adds another piece to this picture. According to the show, Lois met Peter when he was working as a towel boy, employed by her aunt. This detail matters because it places Peter, quite literally, in a service position relative to Lois and her extended family from the very beginning of their relationship. He was not an equal she met through friends or through work in the same field. He was someone hired to serve towels to wealthy people like her relatives, and somewhere in that setting, the two of them met and eventually fell for each other. It is easy to imagine how uncomfortable a detail like this must have been for a family like the Pewterschmidts, a family clearly built around status and appearances. Their daughter did not simply marry someone from a modest background. She married a man she first encountered while he was working a low-paying service job for her own family members. Picture the actual moment this might have happened. A pool day at some large, well-kept property owned by wealthy relatives, staff moving quietly in the background handling towels, drinks, and small tasks nobody in the family wants to think about. Peter, presumably one of these staff members, and Lois, a young woman from the family that owns the property, crossing paths in a setting built entirely around a divide between the people being served and the people doing the serving. Whatever spark passed between them in that moment ended up erasing that divide completely, at least for the two of them personally, even though it likely never stopped mattering to the rest of her family watching from the sidelines. None of this alone would be enough to call Lois a character built on hidden secrets. Wealthy families falling out with working-class sons-in-law is a common enough setup in fiction. What makes Lois Lois genuinely layered is a second secret buried even deeper than her family fortune, one tied not to money but to faith and identity. In the show, it is revealed that Lois's mother, Barbara Pewterschmidt, is Jewish and that she is a survivor of the Holocaust who chose to hide her Jewish identity for most of her life. Lois herself was raised as a Protestant, with no real understanding growing up that her mother's actual background was something entirely different from the faith she was taught to practice. This is worth sitting with carefully, because it is not a small or throwaway detail. A Holocaust survivor choosing to hide her Jewish identity is a decision rooted in real historical horror. In the aftermath of one of the most devastating events of the 20th century, survivors of the Holocaust who later concealed their Jewish background often did so out of a very real and understandable fear, carrying with them memories of persecution so severe that hiding who they were felt safer than being open about it. Whatever the specific reasons behind Barbara Pewterschmidt's choice within the world of the show, the underlying idea mirrors something that happened to real people in real history. Families sometimes buried parts of their identity so deeply that even their own children grew up without knowing the full truth about where they came from. Think about what it must take to carry a secret like that for an entire lifetime. Raising children, running a household, appearing at social events among other wealthy families, all while holding on to memories tied to some of the worst events in modern history, and never once letting that history slip into conversation. That kind of silence does not happen by accident. It takes constant, careful effort to maintain across decades, never once letting a detail slip that might reveal the truth to children who trust their parents completely and have no reason to question the story they have been told about their own family. For Lois, this means she spent much of her life believing she belonged to one religious background, only to eventually learn that her mother's actual heritage was something else entirely. The show adds another layer of tension to this by showing how both sides of Lois's extended family react to the reveal. Her father-in-law, Peter's own father, Francis Griffin, was a devout Roman Catholic, and the discovery of Lois's Jewish heritage through her mother creates friction with him. On the other side, her own father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is shown to resent the reveal as well, uncomfortable with how it complicates the carefully built image of the Pewterschmidt family name. So this single piece of hidden family history manages to unsettle both families Lois is connected to, the wealthy one she was born into and the working class one she married into, each reacting badly to a truth that had been buried for years before finally coming out. It is worth pausing on what this means for Lois as a person, separate from the comedy built around it. She grew up thinking she understood exactly who she was and where she came from, only to learn later in life that a core piece of her own identity had been hidden from her the entire time by the person closest to her, her own mother. That is not a small thing to carry, even inside a cartoon built mostly around jokes and chaos. Underneath the surface of a sitcom, mom who spends her days managing a loud, unpredictable household sits someone whose sense of her own family history is more complicated and more layered than almost anyone in Quahog probably realizes. There is a third secret tied to Lois, one that has nothing to do with money or faith and everything to do with how she was originally designed to look. Fans today know Lois by her curled orange-red hair, a look that has stayed consistent through nearly every season of the show. But that was not always the plan. In the earliest pilot pitch for Family Guy, before the show had even been picked up by a network, Lois was drawn with blonde hair and a pink top, a completely different look from the character audiences would come to know. Somewhere between that early pitch and the final version of the show that made it to air, the decision was made to change her hair color, giving her the red hair that has become one of her most recognizable features. This kind of early design change might seem like a small production detail compared to hidden family wealth or a concealed religious background, but it says something important about how television characters actually come together. Lois, as fans know her today, was not fully formed from the very beginning. She went through changes before ever reaching the screen, the same way a person's appearance might shift and settle over time before they become who they are permanently recognized as. The woman who spends every episode managing her husband's chaos and raising 3 unpredictable children was, at one point, a completely different-looking character on a page, with a completely different hair color, before the show settled on the version that has lasted more than 2 decades. The final piece of Lois worth understanding sits behind the microphone rather than inside the story itself. Lois is voiced by Alex Borstein, who has played the character since the very beginning of the show, including the original pilot. According to Borstein's own account of how she developed the voice, she based Lois's speaking style on a cousin of hers from Long Island. Borstein has explained that she originally performed this voice in a stage show she was doing at the time, and she carried that same voice over when she auditioned for the role of Lois. In her original form, the voice was much slower than what fans hear today. Borstein has said that Seth MacFarlane told her the pace would make Family Guy run 4 hours long if she kept talking that way, and asked her to speed it speeded up. Over the years, as the show continued, Borstein has noted that the voice kept shifting further, becoming higher, faster, and quicker with each passing season compared to where it started. At the time she was developing this voice and eventually landing the role, Alex Borstein was working on the sketch comedy series Mad TV, a show built around fast-paced character work and short comedic bits performed live in front of an audience. This detail matters because it shows that Lois's voice did not arrive already fully formed for a half-hour animated sitcom. It came from a live stage performance, tied to a real family member of Borstein's, then reshaped and adjusted specifically to fit the pace and rhythm that an animated show like Family Guy required. The steady, sometimes exasperated voice fans hear every week did not begin as something designed for television at all. It began as an impression of a real relative, performed on a stage, long before Lois Griffin existed as a character in any real sense. Taken together, these different layers paint a picture of Lois that goes far beyond the patient mother figure most casual viewers picture when her name comes up. She was born into extreme wealth that she eventually chose to walk away from in favor of an ordinary, sometimes chaotic life with a man her own family looked down on. She grew up believing in one religious identity, only to later learn that her mother had spent years hiding a very different one, rooted in surviving one of history's darkest chapters. She was originally imagined with a completely different appearance before the show settled on the design fans recognize today, and the voice she speaks in every single episode began as an impression of someone else entirely, shaped through live comedy work before it ever became the sound audiences associate with her. None of these secrets are the kind that get discussed loudly or often when people talk about Family Guy. Most conversations about the show tend to focus on Peter's antics, Stewie's plotting, or the show's willingness to push boundaries with its humor. Lois, by comparison, often gets treated as the background figure who exists mainly to react to everyone else. But sitting with these details a little longer shows a character shaped by real historical weight, genuine family complexity, and small but meaningful production choices that most viewers never think to look for. The calm, steady woman managing a loud household on Spooner Street carries a family history involving hidden wealth, a hidden faith, a missing brother turned criminal, and a voice built from a real family member's speech pattern, refined over years until it became something entirely her own. There is one more thing worth noting before moving on, and it has to do with how quietly all of this sits within the show itself. Family Guy is not a series known for subtlety. It tends to state things directly, often loudly, sometimes through characters explaining a joke right after making it. Yet Lois's layered background rarely gets treated with that same bluntness. The reveal about her mother's hidden Jewish identity happens within the structure of a single episode built around that specific storyline, and then the show largely moves on, rarely returning to sit with the weight of what that reveal actually means for Lois as a person who spent her whole life without knowing the full truth about her own family. The show hands viewers a genuinely heavy piece of personal history, and then, true to its own style, keeps moving forward without dwelling on it the way another kind of show might. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Right next to Lois for over 2 decades on screen sits a son whose entire voice was shaped by something far darker than a stage impression or a family joke about hidden wealth. Where Lois carries secrets buried in family history and quiet family shame, her son Chris carries a hidden influence pulled directly from one of the most disturbing characters ever put on film, a connection the show itself would later choose to acknowledge out loud. Section 3. Chris Griffin. Built on a serial killer's voice. Chris Griffin is usually seen as the harmless one. He is not sharp like Stewie, not calculating like Lois, and not nearly as reckless as his father. He struggles in school. He has trouble talking to girls, and he spends a lot of his time drawing or thinking about food. Compared to almost everyone else in his family, Chris comes across as gentle, a little slow, and mostly good-natured, which makes it all the stranger when you learn where his voice actually came from, because the inspiration behind it has nothing gentle about it at all. Chris is voiced by an actor named Seth Green, someone who has spent decades working in film and television. Long before Family Guy, and continuing alongside it, Seth Green built a career doing all kinds of voice work and on-screen acting, eventually helping to create the adult animated sketch show Robot Chicken, a series known for a similar brand of quick, dark, and often strange humor that lines up closely with the tone Family Guy is known for. The two shows share a lot of that same comedic DNA, and it is not an accident that fans of one often end up watching the other. Both shows lean into rapid pacing, dark jokes delivered without much warning, and a willingness to reference other movies and shows in ways that reward viewers who already know the source material being pulled from. Seth Green has a natural gift for character voices, for shifting tone and pitch to fit almost any kind of role he is asked to play. That flexibility personality is part of what made him such a strong fit for animated comedy in the first place, since voice acting for cartoons often demands exactly this kind of range, the ability to sound completely different from one project to the next while still bringing genuine personality to each new role. But the specific choice he made when auditioning for the role of Chris Griffin is where this story actually gets interesting. According to Family Guy producers, and according to Seth Green himself in later interviews, the voice of Chris Griffin was inspired by a character from a very different kind of film altogether. That character is Buffalo Bill, the serial killer from the 1991 movie The Silence of the Lambs. For anyone unfamiliar with that film, Silence of the Lambs is a serious, deeply unsettling crime thriller, one of the most well-known and critically respected movies of its era. It follows a young FBI trainee working to track down a dangerous serial killer known as Buffalo Bill, with help from another notorious criminal being held in custody. Buffalo Bill himself is portrayed as deeply disturbing, a character built to frighten audiences rather than entertain them in any lighthearted way. He is not a comedic figure in any sense. He exists in the film purely to unsettle people, to represent something genuinely dark and dangerous, the kind of character built specifically to leave a lasting, uncomfortable impression on anyone who watches the film. Somehow, out of that character came the voice of one of the gentlest, most harmless kids on network television. The story of how this actually happened traces back to Seth Green's own audition for the role of Chris, long before the show had aired a single episode. According to accounts Green has given in interviews, the idea did not come from a scripted direction handed to him by casting directors or by MacFarlane himself. It came from something far more casual. One night, while spending time with a friend, Green and this friend were fooling around with different voices, the kind of thing people sometimes do just to make each other laugh. This is an ordinary enough activity between friends, trying out impressions of movie characters, celebrities, or exaggerated accents purely for entertainment, with no plan or purpose beyond making each other laugh in the moment. At some point during that session, Green tried out an impression of Buffalo Bill, mimicking the character's strange, unsettling way of speaking from the film. His friend found it funny enough to remember, and when Green had an audition coming up for a role on an upcoming animated show, his friend dared him to actually use that voice, the Buffalo Bill impression, during the audition itself. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is a genuinely bold decision for an audition. Most actors walking into a room to read for an animated family comedy would choose something safe, something that clearly signals the right tone for the character being cast. A goofy voice, a young-sounding voice, maybe something a little awkward or nervous, fitting for a character described as an average teenage boy. Casting directors sitting through dozens of auditions in a single day generally expect a certain kind of predictability. Actors offering variations on a small handful of obvious choices that all clearly fit the role being described to them. Instead, dared by a friend, Seth Green walked in and delivered lines using a voice modeled after a fictional serial killer, tweaking it slightly so that it sounded less like a direct impression of Buffalo Bill and more like something coming out over a public address system, a subtle distortion layered on top of the original inspiration. It was a strange, risky choice for an audition built around casting the voice of a teenage son in a family sitcom, and it worked. According to Green's own account, the casting team liked what they heard. Whatever specific quality came through in that odd, filtered version of a serial killer's voice, it clicked with what the show needed for Chris. Green got the role, and that voice, born out of a dare between friends messing around one evening, became permanently attached to one of the show's 4 main family members. It is easy to imagine the surprise in that casting room, hearing an audition built around a completely unexpected reference point, and somehow recognizing that the strange choice actually worked better than any of the safer options other actors were likely bringing in that same day. It is worth pausing here to think about how differently this single decision could have gone. If Green had chosen a safer voice for that audition, if his friend had never dared him to try the Buffalo Bill impression, Chris Griffin, as audiences know him today, might have sounded completely different. The entire tone of his character might have shifted along with it, since so much of how audiences read a cartoon character comes from how that character sounds, not just what they say. A different voice might have pushed Chris toward a more typical, more predictable teenage archetype, something closer to a standard, awkward sitcom son without the same subtle strangeness sitting underneath his delivery. Instead, one small dare between 2 friends fooling around at home ended up shaping how millions of people would come to know a fictional teenage son for more than 2 decades. What makes this story even stranger is how directly the show itself eventually chose to acknowledge the connection, rather than letting it stay a quiet, behind-the-scenes fact known only to interview readers and dedicated fans. Later in the show's run, Family Guy included a moment where Chris directly reenacts a specific scene from Silence of the Lambs, the same unsettling dance performed by Buffalo Bill in front of a camera in the original film. Rather than treating the connection as a secret to be kept hidden in interviews, the show chose to put the reference right on screen, letting the joke work on two levels at once. On the surface, it plays as a strange, memorable moment involving Chris being caught doing something odd and awkward. Underneath that surface, for anyone aware of the voice casting story, it becomes a direct nod back to the very inspiration behind Chris's voice in the first place, turned into an actual scene rather than staying a piece of trivia buried in an old interview. This kind of choice says something about how self-aware Family Guy tends to be about its own production history. Plenty of shows would rather keep an odd casting story like this quiet, treating it as behind-the-scenes trivia not meant for the audience to notice. Family Guy instead pulled the reference directly into an episode, turning private audition history into an on-screen joke that rewards viewers who happen to know where Chris's voice actually came from. It is a small example of how the show sometimes treats its own real-world production quirks as material worth building jokes around, rather than something to be hidden away from the audience entirely. This kind of self-reference also builds a strange sense of closeness between the show and its most attentive fans, the ones who have gone looking for interviews and behind-the-scenes stories, rewarding that curiosity with a joke that only fully lands once someone already knows the history sitting behind it. There is also something worth noting about how unusual this piece of trivia is compared to most character voice origin stories in animation. Many animated characters get their voices from fairly simple sources. A writer wants a gruff old man, so the actor reads gruff and old. A show wants an excitable child, so the actor leans into something high-pitched and energetic. Character voices in animation often come from fairly direct, practical choices, tied closely to what the character needs to sound like on the page. Chris Griffin's voice took a much stranger path, pulled from a serious crime thriller, filtered through a private joke between friends, tested as a bold gamble during an audition, and then kept once it turned out to actually work for the character being cast. It did not come from a writer describing what Chris should sound like. It came from an actor bringing something entirely unrelated into the room, and having it land regardless, a rare case where the performer's own personal history shaped the character more than any decision made in the writer's room. It also says something about Seth Green as a performer, that he was willing to take that gamble in the first place. Auditions are high-pressure moments. Actors generally understand that casting directors are looking for something specific, something that fits clearly into the role being filled, and most performers try to give exactly that rather than risking a choice that might read as strange or off-putting. Choosing to bring in a voice modeled after one of cinema's more disturbing villains for a role meant to become a teenage son on a family-focused animated comedy was not a safe decision. It could easily have gone the other way, with casting directors finding the choice too strange or too unsettling for the character they were trying to fill. Instead, it happened to land exactly right, giving Chris a voice that carries a faint, strange edge underneath its more innocent surface, something that makes him sound just a little different from a completely ordinary cartoon teenager, even if most viewers could never place exactly why. This detail also changes how a person might listen to Chris the next time they watch an episode. Once you know that his voice traces back to one of film history's most unsettling villains, it becomes hard to hear him the same way again. Not because Chris himself is menacing in any way. He is not. He remains one of the more harmless, easily overwhelmed characters on the show, someone far more likely to be confused or overwhelmed by a situation than to cause real harm to anyone around him. But there is a strange kind of tension sitting underneath that innocence once you know where the voice actually came from, a quiet reminder that even something as simple as a character's speaking voice can carry a much stranger history than most viewers would ever assume just from watching the show. There is a broader pattern worth noticing here too, one that applies well beyond just Chris. Long-running animated shows accumulate all kinds of hidden production history over the years. Decisions made quickly during auditions, casual choices from writers' rooms, small creative risks that only later become permanent parts of a show's identity. Most of these choices are never meant to be secrets exactly. They simply are not the kind of detail that ends up being widely discussed unless someone goes looking specifically for interviews, commentary tracks, or older behind-the-scenes coverage. Chris Griffin's voice sits in exactly that category. It has been mentioned publicly by both the show's producers and by Seth Green himself, yet it remains the kind of fact that surprises a lot of longtime fans the first time they hear it laid out clearly, because it is simply not the sort of thing most people think to ask about while watching a show built primarily around jokes and chaos. It also helps explain a small piece of why Chris tends to stand out slightly from the rest of his family, at least vocally. Peter, Lois, Stewie, and even side characters like Quagmire and Brian each have voices built around fairly clear comedic templates: an overgrown man-child, a patient mother, a scheming baby genius, a smooth-talking radio-style ladies' man, an intellectual dog with a dry sense of humor. Chris does not fit quite as cleanly into an obvious comedic mold in the same way. His voice carries a slightly different texture, a little flatter, a little stranger, something that does not immediately scream funny teenage son the way the other voices scream their own character types almost instantly. Now that texture makes more sense. It was never built from scratch to fit a comedic teenage son archetype in the first place. It was pulled sideways from something completely different, then reshaped just enough to fit the role once it happened to work. None of this changes who Chris is as a character within the show itself. He remains someone easily distracted, easily overwhelmed, gentle in most of his interactions, and rarely the smartest person in any given scene. But knowing where his voice actually came from adds a strange undercurrent to every single line he delivers, a quiet reminder sitting underneath even his most harmless moments that his voice was never designed from nothing. It was borrowed, reshaped, and gambled on during a single audition, built out of a dare between friends who had no idea at the time that the joke they were fooling around with would end up becoming a permanent part of American television for more than 2 decades. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not far from Chris, sharing the same house and the same chaotic family dinners, sits his older sister, a character whose own hidden history involves something far less dramatic than a serial killer-inspired voice, but something almost as strange once you actually stop to look closely at who has been speaking for her all along, especially during the moments when she opens her mouth to sing. Section 4. Meg Griffin. The voice you hear isn't always Mila Kunis. Meg Griffin is usually treated as the punching bag of the family. Almost every episode finds some new way to knock her down, whether it comes from her brothers, her parents, kids at school, or just bad luck lining up against her one more time. She gets ignored, insulted, and pushed aside more than any other member of the Griffin household. Because of that constant treatment, most fans think they know exactly who Meg is and exactly what to expect from her. What a lot of people do not know is that the voice they hear during her singing moments is not always the same voice they hear the rest of the time, and that small detail opens up a much bigger story about how animated shows are put together behind the scenes. For most of the show's run, Meg has been voiced by Mila Kunis, an actress who took over the role early on and has stayed attached to the character for the majority of the series since then. Kunis brings a certain flatness and exhaustion to Meg's voice that fits the character well, a tired, worn-down quality that matches a teenager who feels constantly overlooked by everyone around her. Fans know this voice from nearly every regular scene Meg appears in, whether she is complaining about being ignored, getting picked on by Chris, or trying and failing to get some kind of attention or approval from her parents. But there is a specific detail buried in the show's production history that most casual viewers never learn, and it has to do with what happens whenever Meg starts to sing. According to information about the show's production, Mila Kunis does not perform Meg's singing parts. Instead, all of Meg's vocal numbers are handled by a different performer entirely, a veteran voice actress named Tara Strong. This means that anytime Meg opens her mouth to sing on screen, the voice audiences are actually hearing does not belong to the same actress who plays her the rest of the time. It belongs to someone else altogether, someone brought in specifically because of her strength as a singer, rather than her connection to the character in daily dialogue. This detail matters more than it might first appear, because it touches on something that casual viewers rarely think about when watching an animated show. Most people assume that the voice attached to a cartoon character is a single, unified thing, one actor doing everything that character does across every single scene, spoken or sung. It feels natural to assume that whoever handles Meg's regular lines would also be the one singing whenever the story calls for it. Learning that this is not actually true for Meg reveals something important about how television production works behind the scenes, something that applies well beyond just this one character. Singing and speaking, while related, actually call for very different skills. Plenty of talented actors can deliver dialogue with excellent timing, emotion, and comedic instinct, yet still not have the specific vocal training or range needed to carry a full musical number convincingly. Singing on camera or on a soundtrack often demands a different kind of vocal control, one built around pitch, breath, and sustained tone, rather than the quick, natural rhythm needed for spoken conversation. A show creating musical moments for its characters sometimes has to make a practical choice between staying fully loyal to a single voice actor for every single line, or bringing in someone else specifically suited for the musical demands of a particular scene. For Meg's musical moments, Family Guy chose the second option, bringing in Tara Strong to fill that specific need, rather than asking Mila Kunis to carry the singing herself. Tara Strong herself is far from an unknown name in the world of animation. She has built one of the most extensive and respected careers in voice acting, working across a huge number of animated shows and video games over several decades, known especially for her flexibility and range as a performer. Bringing someone with that level of experience into Family Guy specifically for Meg's musical numbers was was not a small or careless choice. It reflects a deliberate decision to prioritize strong vocal performance during singing scenes over strict consistency in who happens to be behind the microphone for the character at every single moment. This raises an interesting question worth sitting with for a moment. If a different actress is handling Meg's singing voice, does that mean audiences are technically hearing two different versions of Meg anytime an episode includes a musical scene involving her character? In a strict, literal sense, the answer is yes. The voice delivering Meg's regular dialogue and the voice delivering her singing come from two separate performers, brought together within the same character, but never actually the same physical voice. Most viewers never notice this split while watching, since animated shows are edited carefully enough that the transition between spoken lines and sung ones tends to feel smooth and natural, rather than jarring or obviously mismatched. The illusion of a single, consistent character holds together even though two different people are contributing to it. This kind of practice is actually more common across animation and film than many casual viewers realize, though it rarely gets talked about directly with most shows. Musicals and animated productions with musical elements sometimes bring in specialized singing voices for characters whose regular speaking voice belongs to someone without the same vocal training needed for a demanding musical number. Family Guy quietly follows this same pattern with Meg, splitting her voice between two different performers depending on whether she is speaking or singing, without ever drawing much attention to the switch itself. Understanding this detail changes how Meg's character feels a little bit. The same way learning about Chris's voice inspiration reshapes how his lines land once you know where that voice actually came from. Meg is constantly treated within the show as someone overlooked, someone whose voice, in the more general sense of being heard and valued, gets ignored again and again by the people closest to her. There is a strange, almost poetic layer sitting underneath the literal production fact that even her actual singing voice on the show does not fully belong to her either, handled instead by someone else stepping in whenever a musical moment calls for it. It is not something the show intended as commentary, since it comes down to a straightforward, practical decision about casting the right performer for a specific vocal task. But knowing it happens adds an unexpected texture to a character whose entire arc revolves around being pushed aside and unheard within her own family. There is also something worth noting about how little this fact tends to be discussed compared to some of the show's more famous behind-the-scenes stories. Details like Seth MacFarlane voicing multiple main characters, or Chris's voice being inspired by a film villain, tend to circulate fairly widely among fans who follow the show closely. The quieter fact about Meg's singing voice belonging to someone else entirely gets far less attention, likely because musical moments make up a smaller portion of the show compared to regular dialogue scenes. Meg does not sing constantly throughout the series. Her musical appearances are occasional rather than routine, which means most viewers simply never end up hearing enough of her singing to notice or question whether the voice sounds slightly different from her usual speaking voice. This detail also says something small but genuine about how television production balances creative goals against practical limits. A show could, in theory, insist on total consistency, requiring every actor to handle every single vocal demand tied to their character no matter what. In practice, shows regularly make exceptions when a specific moment calls for a skill that the primary actor simply does not have, choosing a stronger overall result for the audience over rigid consistency behind the scenes. Family Guy made that same choice with Meg, prioritizing a stronger singing performance over insisting that Mila Kunis handle every single vocal moment attached to the character herself. None of this changes who Meg is within the story itself, and it does not take anything away from Mila Kunis, who has voiced the character in nearly every other capacity for most of the show's history. Meg remains the constantly overlooked daughter, someone whose struggles for attention and approval form one of the more consistent threads running through the entire series. But the next time an episode includes one of her rare musical moments, there is now a quiet piece of trivia sitting underneath it, a reminder that the voice carrying that particular tune belongs to someone else entirely, brought in specifically because the moment called for a different kind of vocal skill than the one needed for Meg's usual dialogue. It is a small secret compared to some of the more dramatic reveals tied to other characters on this show, but it fits into a larger pattern worth noticing across nearly every member of the Griffin family. Behind almost every voice fans think they know completely sits some kind of decision, adjustment, or hidden history that never makes it into the show itself, staying buried instead in interviews, behind-the-scenes notes, and small details that only come to light for anyone willing to look closely enough to find them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Down the hall from Meg's bedroom sits her youngest brother, a character whose own voice carries a secret history reaching back to a famous stage and screen actor from decades before the show even existed. existed, tied to a planned storyline about identity and sexuality that the network ultimately chose never to let audiences see. Section 5. Stewie Griffin, the coming-out episode that was made but never aired. Stewie Griffin is easily one of the strangest characters on television. He is a one-year-old baby with an upper-class British accent, an advanced vocabulary, and plans for world domination that most grown adults would struggle to explain, let alone carry out. Almost nothing about him fits what people expect from a baby, and that gap between his appearance and his behavior is exactly what made him stand out from the very first episode. But underneath the accent, the scheming, and the constant attempts on his mother's life sits a piece of production history involving a full episode built around one of the most personal questions the show ever tried to explore, an episode that was actually finished but never allowed to air. The place to start with Stewie is his voice, since that is where his identity as a character truly began. Stewie is voiced by Seth MacFarlane himself, the same person who provides the voice for Peter, Brian, and Quagmire. According to MacFarlane, Stewie's accent was based on the voice of an English actor named Rex Harrison, particularly drawing from Harrison's performance as Professor Henry Higgins in the 1964 musical film My Fair Lady. Harrison played Higgins as fussy, demanding, and endlessly particular about how people around him spoke and behaved, a character built around control and correction. My Fair Lady itself was a hugely popular film in its time, based on an even older stage play, and Higgins remains one of the most well-remembered characters from that entire era of movie musicals, largely because of how precisely Harrison performed the role, clipped and exact in every line he delivered. MacFarlane has described being a fan of musicals, and has said there was something about Harrison's performance that struck him as both amusing and slightly ridiculous, enough that he decided to imagine that exact voice coming out of the body of a baby instead of a grown man. That single idea, an adult-sounding voice trapped inside an infant, became the foundation for everything Stewie would eventually become. MacFarlane has talked about this connection more than once over the years, describing Stewie in interviews as something close to an evil version of Rex Harrison. There is also a smaller detail tied to how Stewie got his actual name in the first place. According to MacFarlane, the inspiration for the name Stewie came from a car that belonged to Stan Lee, the comic book writer famous for helping create so many well-known superhero characters. It is a strange, almost random detail sitting behind the name of one of the show's most recognizable characters, tying Stewie's identity back not just to a British stage actor from decades earlier, but also, in a small and unexpected way, to the world of comic books through the naming of a car. It is worth pausing on how odd this pairing actually is once you say it out loud. A baby with the voice of a fussy English professor from an old musical, carrying a name borrowed indirectly from a car owned by one of the most famous names in comic book history. Almost nothing about Stewie's origin points in one single direction. Stewie did not start out as the character audiences know today either. When the show first began, he was written mostly as a straightforward supervillain, a baby obsessed with matricide and world domination, played largely for shock and dark comedy rather than emotional depth. Early episodes leaned hard into that shock value, treating Stewie almost like a small-scale cartoon version of a classic movie villain, someone whose extreme threats against his own mother were meant to land purely as dark, absurd comedy, rather than anything with real emotional weight behind it. As the show continued into its second season, the writers began giving Stewie more layers, moving him beyond a simple villain archetype and starting to explore something more complicated, sitting underneath his constant scheming. That exploration eventually led the writers toward one of the more sensitive threads in the character's history, a slow, ongoing examination of Stewie's sexuality. This exploration showed up gradually, through small moments scattered across different episodes rather than one single dramatic reveal. In certain episodes, the show hinted that Stewie might be gay, using brief jokes and quiet visual details rather than direct statements. In one episode, a cutaway shows Stewie's phone screen displaying a picture of a muscular man. In another, he is shown carrying a photo of actor Chris Noth in his wallet. There are also moments where Stewie expresses interest toward Brian's son Dylan, and other scenes where he seems on the verge of directly stating something about his identity before getting interrupted, a pattern the show returned to more than once for comedic timing. At other points, the show pulls in the opposite direction entirely, showing Stewie falling for a young girl named Janet and appearing to react as an unhappy, repressed young man dealing with feelings he does not fully understand or accept. Taken together, these moments create a pattern that never fully settles in one direction, a back and forth the writers seem to return to again and again across many different seasons rather than treating it as a single storyline that gets wrapped up and closed. Seth MacFarlane has spoken directly about this uncertainty in interviews, explaining that Stewie began purely as a diabolical villain before the writers started exploring his confused sexuality as the character character developed further. According to MacFarlane, the writers largely agreed that Stewie is almost certainly gay and is in the process of figuring that out for himself, though the show never fully locked into a single, permanent answer. MacFarlane has explained that keeping the question open gave the writers more material to work with, since jokes could come from either direction depending on the specific episode being written. He has also said that when he imagines what Stewie might become as he grows older, he pictures either a gay man or a deeply unhappy, repressed heterosexual man, someone caught between who he actually is and who he feels pressured to appear to be. Both possibilities carry real weight. Painting Stewie as someone whose sharp wit and constant scheming might partly be covering for a much more uncertain, unresolved part of himself underneath. This uncertainty was never treated as accidental or careless within the show's own internal history. According to commentary tied to the direct-to-video release Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, the writers actually discussed a much clearer plan at one point, one where Stewie would openly discover that he was gay rather than remaining in this constant state of ambiguity. That plan reportedly went further than just internal discussion. According to reporting on the show's production history, MacFarlane originally intended for the third season to end with Stewie coming out of the closet, following some kind of near-death experience within the story that would push him toward finally confronting and revealing that part of himself. A near-death experience as a turning point fits neatly with how the show usually handles big emotional shifts, using an extreme, dramatic event to force a character toward a moment of honesty they might otherwise keep avoiding indefinitely. An episode built around exactly that idea was actually produced. According to reporting on the show's history, an episode titled Queer as Stewie was written and completed, meant to carry forward this planned reveal about Stewie's identity. But the show's abrupt cancellation around that same period interrupted these plans before the episode could ever be broadcast. Family Guy was pulled from its original run partway through, and by the time the show eventually returned, thanks to strong fan demand and continued interest, the specific storyline built around that episode had already lost its place in the show's ongoing timeline. The episode itself, despite being finished, was never aired. Instead of following through on the original plan for Stewie's identity, MacFarlane made the choice to keep Stewie sexually ambiguous going forward, treating the flexibility of not settling the question as something that gave the writers more creative freedom rather than less. This is a genuinely rare piece of television history. It is one thing for a show to consider an idea and quietly drop it during early planning stages, long before any actual production work goes into it. It is a very different thing for a full episode to be written, recorded, and completed, only to be shelved entirely and never shown to the public because of circumstances completely unrelated to the quality or content of the episode itself. Queer as Stewie exists as a finished piece of the show's history, sitting somewhere in Fox's archives, built around a storyline that could have permanently changed how one of the show's most iconic characters was understood by audiences going forward. Instead, because of the show's cancellation and eventual return years later, that version of Stewie's story never became part of the public record. It remains, as far as audiences are concerned, a piece of television that exists, but that almost nobody outside the production itself has ever actually seen. The show did eventually return to this same territory decades later, in a very different way. In the series' 300th episode, titled Send in Stewie Please, the show built an entire commercial-free episode around a therapy session between Stewie and a school psychologist. Reaching a 300th episode is itself a significant milestone for any television show, and choosing to mark that milestone with a serious, extended look at one of the show's oldest-running questions says something about how much weight the writers still placed on this particular piece of Stewie's character, even decades after it first began. During this session, both of the show's long-running questions about Stewie get addressed directly for the first time in a serious, extended way: his sexuality and the true nature of his British accent. According to reporting on the episode, Stewie eventually reveals to the therapist that his accent is not natural at all, describing it instead as something closer to armor, a performance he uses to get through each day, rather than his real, unguarded voice. When Stewie switches to what he claims is his actual voice, it sounds far more ordinary, closer to an ordinary young boy with a slight trace of his father's accent mixed in, rather than the polished, upper-class British tone audiences have heard from him for years. According to one of the show's writers speaking about that particular episode, the goal was never to have Stewie definitively come out as gay or as straight in any final, settled way. Instead, the intention was to let him remain permanently caught in that same state of confusion that would realistically match someone his age, still working through questions about identity, choosing to explore that uncertainty on a deeper level rather than resolving it with a simple, clean answer. This lines up closely with what MacFarlane has said in earlier interviews, treating Stewie's ambiguous identity as something the show intends to hold on to rather than something waiting waiting to be permanently solved. It suggests that even decades after the original coming-out storyline was shelved, the writers eventually came to see the ongoing uncertainty itself as more interesting and more honest than any single, permanent answer would have been. There is something worth sitting with in how differently this specific piece of Stewie's history unfolded compared to almost everything else covered so far in this video. Peter's voice came from a private joke between college friends. Lois's hidden background involved family wealth and a concealed religious identity revealed within the story itself. Chris's voice traced back to a bold, unusual choice made during a single audition. Meg's singing voice belonged to someone else entirely, a quiet, practical decision made behind the scenes. Stewie's story is different from all of these because it involves a planned creative direction that was actually completed, an entire episode built and finished, only to be lost due to circumstances completely outside the show's own creative control. It was not abandoned because the writers changed their minds. It was abandoned because the show itself nearly ended before that story could ever reach an audience. This detail also reshapes how a person might think about Stewie's constant, unresolved questioning throughout the show's history. It would be easy to assume that the writers simply enjoyed keeping things vague for comedic flexibility from the very beginning, never seriously considering a clearer direction for the character. Knowing that a complete episode existed, built specifically around giving Stewie a defined answer about his identity, changes that assumption entirely. The ambiguity fans have watched play out across hundreds of episodes was not the original plan. It became the plan only after an entirely different, more direct storyline was already finished and then quietly shelved, leaving behind the version of Stewie that audiences actually got to see for the following decades. It also says something about how television production can shape a character's entire future in ways that have nothing to do with writing quality or creative vision. A single business decision, the show's cancellation at a specific moment in its run, ended up permanently altering the direction of one of its most central characters. Had Family Guy continued airing without interruption during that period, Stewie's identity as a character might look completely different today, built around a clear, direct reveal, rather than the decades of hints, jokes, and unresolved moments that ended up defining him instead. Instead, a scheduling and business disruption, something entirely separate from the show's actual writing, ended up reshaping how one of television's most recognizable characters would be written for years afterward. None of this changes who Stewie is within the show as it actually exists today. He remains brilliant, dramatic, endlessly plotting, and just as likely to threaten his mother's life in one scene as he is to show real affection for her in the next. But knowing about the finished, unaired episode and about the specific plan that existed before the show's cancellation disrupted it adds a strange, almost haunting layer underneath every single joke and hint about his identity scattered across the show's long run. Every unfinished sentence, every interrupted moment where Stewie seems just seconds away from saying something definite about himself carries a little more weight once you know that a version of this story was actually written all the way through, completed, and then locked away, never given the chance to reach the audience it was made for. Next door, quite literally, in the house sitting beside the Griffins on Spooner Street, lives a neighbor whose entire personality seems built around indulgence and reckless behavior, but whose real name on his own birth certificate is not even the one everyone in Quahog actually calls him by. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next door, quite literally, in the house sitting beside the Griffins on Spooner Street, lives a neighbor whose entire personality seems built around indulgence and reckless behavior, but whose real name on his own birth certificate is not even the one everyone in Quahog actually calls him by. Section 6. Glenn Quagmire. His real name isn't Quagmire. Glenn Quagmire lives right next door to the Griffins, and for most of the show's run, he has functioned as the neighborhood's most reckless presence, a man defined almost entirely by impulsive behavior and a complete lack of restraint. He talks fast, moves fast, and rarely thinks twice before acting on whatever idea crosses his mind. Fans know him for his catchphrase, for his job as an airline pilot, and for a personality built around indulgence in almost every direction imaginable. What a lot of viewers do not know is that even his own name, the one everyone in Quahog calls him by every single day, is not actually the name he was born with. According to the show itself, revealed directly within an episode, Glenn Quagmire was not always named Quagmire at all. His original surname was something else entirely, a Polish name spelled Quagelczyk, sometimes given as Quagelczyk, depending on the specific source describing it. At some point in his life, this original family name was changed to the shorter, simpler Quagmire that everyone now recognizes. The show reveals this detail through the character himself, allowing audiences to learn that the name attached to one of its most familiar side characters was, at some earlier point, something completely different, tied to a heritage the show rarely brings up outside of this one specific horrific reveal. It is a strange thing to picture. A character defined so completely by his own name and his own catchphrase, treated by fans as inseparable from that identity, actually carrying a completely different name underneath it for some earlier stretch of his life that the show almost never returns to. This detail matters more than it might first seem, because names carry weight, especially family names passed down from earlier generations. A name like Quagelchek or Quagelchik points toward Eastern European roots, likely Polish, given how the show itself describes it. Shortening or changing a family name like this is something that has happened many times throughout real history, often tied to earlier generations trying to make their names easier for others to pronounce, or trying to blend in more easily within a new country or community. Families arriving in a new country with long, unfamiliar-sounding names have often faced pressure, spoken or unspoken, to shorten or simplify those names so that neighbors, co-workers, and officials could say them more easily. Whether the show intended any of that historical weight when writing this detail into an episode, the reveal itself still connects Quagmire to a background far more specific and far more rooted in real-world immigration patterns than most viewers would ever expect from a character mostly known for his catchphrase and his constant pursuit of casual relationships. The origin of Quagmire's actual first name carries its own small story as well, though this one comes from outside the show rather than from within it. According to interviews given by Seth MacFarlane, the name Quagmire itself was chosen by a college acquaintance of his, someone from around the same period in his life when he was developing early character ideas and voices. This means that even the surname audiences know him by today, Quagmire, was not something MacFarlane invented entirely on his own. It came from someone else, a friend or classmate, whose specific contribution to the character's identity rarely gets discussed compared to bigger, more dramatic details about the show's production history. It is a small reminder that even a character as recognizable as Quagmire did not spring fully formed from one single creative mind working alone. Pieces of him were handed over by other people along the way, shaping a character who would eventually become one of the most familiar faces in the entire show. The voice behind Quagmire has its own clear origin story as well, one MacFarlane has explained directly in interviews. According to MacFarlane, Quagmire's fast-talking, exaggerated style of speaking came from listening to old radio jockeys from the 1950s, the kind of quick, smooth-talking announcers who used to host music and entertainment programs over the radio during that era. Radio announcers from that period were known for a very specific kind of delivery: rapid, confident, almost performative, built to keep listeners engaged purely through sound, during an era when radio was one of the main sources of home entertainment. MacFarlane has described the character in blunt terms, calling him something close to a 1950s radio guy hopped up on modern-day energy, a description meant to capture just how rapid and stylized Quagmire's voice actually sounds compared to a normal, natural way of speaking. That specific comparison, an old-fashioned radio announcer pushed into overdrive, captures something real about how distinct Quagmire sounds compared to almost every other character on the show, built around a very specific vocal style pulled directly from a much older era of entertainment history. Quagmire's most famous catchphrase carries its own separate origin story, one that traces back not to MacFarlane himself, but to a different member of the show's creative team. According to reporting on the show's production history, the phrase giggity, the sound most closely associated with Quagmire across the entire run of the show, was inspired by an impression that writer Steve Marmel used to do of comedian Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis was a famous American comedian, known for his exaggerated physical comedy and distinct vocal style, someone whose influence stretched across decades of American comedy history, shaping the style of countless performers who came after him. Somewhere in the writer's room, Marmel's impression of Lewis apparently became the seed for what eventually turned into Quagmire's signature sound, a phrase that has since become one of the most recognized and repeated catchphrases in the entire history of the show. It is worth pausing on how strange this chain of influence actually is. A decades-old comedian's specific vocal style, filtered through one writer's private impression of him, eventually becoming a single word repeated constantly by a fictional airline pilot on a modern animated sitcom. This detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it shows how a single character's identity on Family Guy often comes together from several completely different, unrelated sources rather than one single, unified creative vision. Quagmire's surname traces back to a real family name changed at some earlier point, tied loosely to Polish heritage. His current surname, as fans know it, came from a suggestion made by a college friend of MacFarlane's. His actual voice traces back to old-fashioned radio announcers from decades before the show existed, and his single most famous catchphrase traces back to a completely different writer's impression of a famous mid-century comedian. None of these pieces came from the same place. They were pulled together from different corners of of pop culture history and combined into one single character, someone who now feels completely whole and consistent to audiences, despite being built from so many separate, unrelated influences. It raises an interesting question about how many other seemingly simple cartoon characters carry this same kind of scattered, borrowed history, sitting quietly underneath a surface that looks completely unified to anyone watching casually. There is more to Quagmire's story worth understanding, beyond just these origin details, because the show also builds a surprisingly full and often dark backstory around him as the series continues. Quagmire is shown as a former member of the United States Navy, having served as an ensign, which is where he originally crossed paths with Peter Griffin. According to the show's own continuity, established specifically in the episode Meet the Quagmires, Quagmire actually knew both Peter and Lois well before either of them settled into their current life together, adding an entire earlier layer of history to a friendship audiences mostly only see in its current, adult form. This means the version of Quagmire fans know today, the reckless neighbor constantly showing up uninvited or shouting his catchphrase from somewhere off screen, is only one chapter of a much longer personal history connecting him to the Griffins, stretching back to a time in their lives long before Spooner Street ever became home to any of them. After his time in the Navy, Quagmire moved into a career as a commercial airline pilot, a job he continues to hold throughout the show's run, one that occasionally becomes relevant to the plot when episodes call for air travel or airport settings. Family history also plays a much bigger role in Quagmire's background than most casual viewers would expect. According to the show, his father, introduced in a specific episode focused on this storyline, is a Vietnam War veteran who later undergoes a gender transition, becoming a woman named Ida. Quagmire is shown reacting to this news with some initial resistance, though the show ultimately depicts him coming around to support his parent through that transition. Quagmire also has a sister named Brenda, introduced in a separate storyline that focuses specifically on the abuse she experiences from a partner, a plotline the show treats with a surprising amount of seriousness compared to its usual comedic tone. According to the show's continuity, Quagmire ultimately takes drastic action to protect his sister from that partner, showing a far more protective, even violent side of his character than his usual lighthearted personality tends to suggest. This protective streak stands out sharply against the usual image of Quagmire as someone driven mostly by impulse and self-interest, revealing a version of him willing to put everything on the line the moment someone in his own family is genuinely threatened. His relationship with his own mother carries its own complicated history as well. According to the show, one specific episode reveals a deeply troubled, uncomfortable relationship between Quagmire and his mother, hinting at inappropriate behavior on her part that the show handles through its usual mix of dark humor layered over something genuinely unsettling underneath. This pattern repeats throughout much of Quagmire's backstory across the show's run. Difficult, sometimes disturbing family history handled through comedy rather than direct emotional weight, creating a strange contrast between how lighthearted Quagmire usually behaves in any given episode and how much genuine difficulty appears to sit underneath his family history once a viewer actually looks closely at it. Taken as a whole, his family history reads less like background material for a side character and more like the kind of complicated, layered backstory usually reserved for a show's central characters, tucked instead into a neighbor who mostly exists to deliver a single catchphrase and cause chaos in the background of other people's storylines. Quagmire's reputation as a womanizing, reckless character is also given a specific, defining moment tied to lost love rather than simple carelessness. According to the show, Quagmire once had a real relationship with a woman named Cheryl Teagues, someone he genuinely loved and considered his one true connection before circumstances led to their separation. Cheryl continues to appear periodically throughout the show's run, often through storylines involving Brian, who repeatedly ends up entangled in Quagmire's feelings toward her, either by accident or through deliberate interference. This detail adds an unexpected layer of genuine longing sitting underneath Quagmire's usual behavior, suggesting that his constant pursuit of casual relationships throughout the show might trace back, at least in part, to an earlier heartbreak he never fully got over. It offers a quieter explanation for behavior that otherwise plays purely as comedy, hinting that underneath the constant pursuit of new relationships sits someone still measuring every new connection against a version of love he lost a long time ago and never managed to replace. There is also a detail tied directly to Quagmire's real-world impact as a piece of pop culture, worth mentioning simply because of how widely his character has spread beyond the show itself. His catchphrase alone has become popular enough to appear on official merchandise, including printed items like key rings, sold specifically because of how recognizable that single word has become among fans. Few side characters on any animated show manage to generate that kind of standalone merchandise built around a single word, yet Quagmire's catchphrase has reached exactly that level of recognition, a direct result of that earlier writer's room decision to borrow an old Jerry Lewis impression and attach it permanently to this specific character. It says something about the strange staying power of a single, well-placed sound. One small vocal choice from decades ago eventually becoming successful enough to print on physical merchandise sold to fans who likely have no idea where that specific sound actually originated. Taken together, all of these details paint a picture of Quagmire that goes well beyond the reckless, constantly pursuing neighbor most casual viewers picture when his name comes up. Underneath the surface sits a man whose original family name pointed toward a completely different heritage, whose current name came from someone other than the show's creator, whose voice was built from a completely different era of American entertainment, and whose single most famous catchphrase traces back to an entirely separate writer borrowing from an entirely separate comedian. Beyond those origin details, his family history includes military service, a parent's gender transition, a sister protected through serious violence, a deeply troubled relationship with his own mother, and a lost love that seems to explain more about his current behavior than most viewers would ever assume from watching a typical episode. None of this changes how Quagmire behaves within any single episode, since the show continues to use him mostly for quick jokes, exaggerated reactions, and his usual pursuit of casual relationships. But understanding where all of these different pieces of his character actually came from adds real depth to someone who might otherwise seem like a fairly simple, one-note presence compared to the more central Griffin family members living right next door to him. His name alone carries a small piece of real-world immigration history. His voice carries an entire era of American radio inside it, and his most famous single word carries the fingerprint of a completely different comedian passed down through one writer's private impression, turned into something millions of viewers now recognize instantly, most of them with no idea just how far back that one small sound actually traces. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Behind almost every character covered so far sits some kind of secret pulled from a real person, a real voice, or a real piece of unfinished production history. But one figure connected to this show carries a secret bigger than any single character, one tied to an idea that was originally meant to shape the entire structure of the series itself, built around a much darker theme than anyone expects from a lighthearted animated family comedy. Section 7. Death, the character who was supposed to run the whole show. Death shows up on Family Guy more than most viewers probably realize. He is usually drawn as a tall, robed figure carrying a scythe, the classic image most people already associate with the idea of death itself, borrowed from centuries of paintings, books, and folklore long before this show ever existed. That image has appeared across countless cultures and time periods, showing up in old artwork, religious stories, and popular movies, well before any cartoon writer ever sat down to sketch out a version of him for television. In the world of Family Guy, though, death is not just a symbol standing quietly in the background. He is an actual character, someone who shows up, talks, argues, and gets pulled into the same kind of ridiculous situations as everyone else in Quahog. What most casual viewers never learn is that this character was originally meant to carry far more weight than he ended up carrying, and that the entire show almost took a completely different shape built around him. To understand this properly, it helps to look closely at how Family Guy actually began, starting with its very first episodes. The show's original first season opened with 4 episodes carrying very specific titles, each one built around the theme of death in some form. The first episode was called Death Has a Shadow. The second was titled I Never Met the Dead Man. The third carried the name Chitty Chitty Death Bang. The fourth was called Mind Over Murder. Looking at these 4 titles together, a clear pattern becomes obvious almost immediately. Every single one revolves around death, murder, or something closely connected to it, even though the actual content of these episodes covers a much wider range of everyday family sitcom material, things like job troubles, awkward family dinners, and misunderstandings between neighbors. A viewer glancing only at those 4 titles, without ever watching a single frame of the actual episodes, would likely assume they were about to watch something dark and unsettling, rather than a lighthearted comedy about a chaotic New England family. This pattern was not an accident, and it was not simply a coincidence created by 4 writers independently landing on similar-sounding titles. According to information about the show's early history, this repeated focus on death as a theme traces back directly to Seth MacFarlane himself, tied to his personal interest in a very specific kind of entertainment from decades before Family Guy ever existed. MacFarlane has been described as a huge fan of suspenseful radio programs from the 1930s and 1940s, an era when radio dramas built entire episodes around mystery, tension, and often death itself, long before television took over as the main form form of home entertainment in most households. During that earlier era, families would gather around a radio in the evening, the same way people later gathered around a television, listening to voices and sound effects build entire worlds inside their imagination, without a single picture to guide them. These old radio shows relied heavily on spooky, dramatic episode titles to pull listeners in, since there were no pictures to grab attention, only sound and suggestion. A good title alone had to do a lot of work convincing someone to tune in and listen, since a listener deciding whether to bother finding the right station at the right time often had nothing more to go on than a single dramatic-sounding name printed in a newspaper listing. MacFarlane apparently wanted to bring some of that same feeling into Family Guy, using death as a kind of underlying thread running through the show, expressed mainly through the way episodes were named, rather than through their actual storylines. This explains why episodes with such heavy, dramatic-sounding titles like Death Has a Shadow or Chitty Chitty Death Bang could still end up being fairly ordinary family comedy episodes underneath, focused on Peter losing a job or dealing with some small personal embarrassment rather than anything genuinely dark or frightening. The titles were meant to echo the feeling of those old radio programs, a nod to a much older style of storytelling that most modern audiences watching a new animated sitcom in 1999 would have had little direct experience with. It is an unusual thing to imagine, a brand new cartoon aimed largely at younger adult audiences, deliberately reaching back toward a style of entertainment that had mostly disappeared decades earlier, folding that old-fashioned instinct into episode titles that most viewers at the time would have had no direct memory of at all. According to reporting on the show's early history, this specific approach did not last very long once the show actually got underway. As Family Guy continued airing, it became clear that building the show's identity so tightly around death as a recurring theme was not something that could realistically continue long-term, especially as the writers began developing other directions for the show's humor and storytelling. What began as a specific stylistic choice tied to MacFarlane's personal taste in old radio dramas gradually faded into the background, leaving behind only a handful of early episode titles as evidence of what the original plan had actually been. The writers instead began pulling the show toward faster-paced jokes, quick pop culture references, and the kind of rapid, unpredictable cutaway humor that would eventually come to define the show's identity far more than any consistent theme running underneath it. There is a second layer to this story that goes beyond just episode titles, tied to the fact that Death himself eventually became an actual, ongoing character within the show, rather than staying just a naming convention applied to early episodes. According to the show's own continuity, Death is a recurring figure who appears across multiple episodes throughout the series, showing up specifically whenever the plot calls for some kind of direct encounter with the idea of dying. One of his most memorable early appearances comes from a storyline where Peter fakes his own death, prompting Death himself to show up and attempt to claim Peter's soul as part of his usual job. Instead of a clean, dramatic collection, the scene turns into something far sillier, with Death accidentally breaking his own ankle during the encounter. Rather than following through with his original task, Death ends up sending Peter out to handle some of his own responsibilities instead, effectively making Peter serve as a stand-in for the literal embodiment of death for a stretch of the story. It is a genuinely strange image once you sit with it directly, one of history's oldest and most feared symbols reduced to hobbling around on a broken ankle, forced to hand his job over to a clumsy, overweight father from Rhode Island because he cannot finish the task himself. This moment captures something important about how Family Guy actually chose to treat its own original death theme once the show settled into its long-term identity. Rather than treating death seriously or symbolically, the show turned the very embodiment of it into a slapstick character, someone who gets hurt easily, who ends up needing help from Peter Griffin of all people, and who becomes just another recurring face in Quahog rather than a mysterious, frightening force hovering over the story. The show effectively took its original, more serious inspiration, rooted in old suspenseful radio dramas, and flipped it completely, turning a symbol built around fear and finality into a comedic character who shows up periodically to be mocked, inconvenienced, or dragged into ridiculous situations alongside everyone else. Where those old radio programs used death as a source of tension meant to keep listeners nervously engaged, Family Guy uses the same idea purely as a setup for physical comedy, treating one of humanity's oldest fears as just another character who can trip, get hurt, or need a favor like anyone else in town. This shift says something worth paying attention to about how Family Guy developed its identity more broadly during its earliest years. The show started with a very specific, almost old-fashioned creative idea in mind, built around MacFarlane's personal love of vintage radio suspense. Very quickly, though, the show moved away from that original vision, choosing instead to lean into a much broader, more chaotic style of comedy, built around fast-paced fast-paced jokes, pop culture references, and constant cutaways, rather than any kind of consistent tone tied to death or mystery. Death as a character stuck around, but he lost almost all of the weight and seriousness that the original naming pattern from those first 4 episodes seemed to be building toward. What could have become a show defined by a consistent, moody undertone running beneath every episode, instead became something far more scattered and unpredictable in tone, better suited to the kind of humor that eventually made the show famous. It is worth pausing here to imagine what Family Guy might have looked like if MacFarlane had actually followed through on this original plan far more thoroughly than he did. If every episode across every season had continued carrying spooky, death-themed titles, and if the show had leaned further into that suspenseful radio drama inspiration rather than drifting away from it after just a handful of episodes, the entire personality of the show could have ended up completely different from what fans know today. Instead of a scattered, joke-driven family comedy built around wild tangents and constant pop culture references, Family Guy might have developed into something closer to a strange hybrid, a sitcom wrapped inside the atmosphere of an old-fashioned mystery radio program, with death hovering over every episode not just as a background character, but as an actual guiding idea shaping the entire show. A viewer tuning into that version of the show every week might have come to expect a certain kind of tension sitting underneath even the lightest storylines, the same way listeners of those old radio dramas came to expect a certain mood the moment they heard a particular kind of title announced before the show began. That version of Family Guy never actually happened, and it is worth understanding exactly why the plan fell apart so quickly. According to reporting on the show's history, the shift away from this original death-focused approach happened naturally as the show developed, without any single dramatic turning point marking the change. The writers simply found other directions that worked better for the kind of comedy they wanted to build, and the early experiment with consistently death-themed episode titles quietly stopped after those first 4 episodes, never returning as a consistent pattern for the rest of the show's run. Death himself stuck around as an occasional character, but the deeper structural idea behind those early titles, treating death as an ongoing atmosphere hanging over the entire show, disappeared almost as quickly as it had shown up. There is also something worth noting about how unusual it is for any long-running television show to reveal this kind of early creative pivot so clearly through nothing more than a handful of episode titles. Most shows go through early adjustments behind the scenes, in writers' rooms, through internal notes and discarded drafts that never become public. Family Guy's early pivot away from its original death-focused concept is unusually visible, sitting right there in plain sight for anyone who bothers to look closely at those first 4 episode titles and notice how sharply that pattern breaks the moment the 5th episode arrives. It is a rare case where a show's earliest creative direction and its quick abandonment can be traced simply by paying attention to names rather than digging through old interviews or production documents. Most viewers watching the show today have likely seen dozens of episodes without ever noticing that the very first 4 carried a naming pattern the rest of the series completely abandoned, a small but genuine piece of evidence hiding in plain sight for anyone willing to look closely enough to spot it. Death's continued presence throughout the show, even after this original plan faded, also says something about how Family Guy tends to hold on to pieces of its earlier ideas even after moving on from the bigger vision they were originally part of. The show did not erase Death from its world entirely once the writers decided against building the whole series around him. Instead, he became one of many recurring background figures the show pulls out whenever a specific storyline calls for him, alongside other familiar faces who show up across multiple seasons without ever becoming full-time main characters. In that sense, Death represents a small, lasting trace of a much bigger original idea that never fully came together, a leftover piece of a plan that once aimed to shape the entire personality of the show before quietly falling away within its very first season. Understanding this piece of the show's history adds an unexpected layer to something that might otherwise seem like a simple, mildly funny recurring gag. Death showing up to accidentally injure himself while trying to collect Peter's soul is, on its own, just another small joke buried among hundreds of similar moments scattered across the show's long run. Knowing that this same character was originally meant to anchor an entire consistent theme running through every single episode changes how that joke lands. It becomes a quiet reminder of a much more serious, much more deliberate creative vision that existed briefly at the very beginning of the show's life, before Family Guy settled into the far more chaotic, unpredictable identity that eventually made it one of the most recognized animated comedies in television history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Somewhere inside the writer's room responsible for building that same chaotic identity sits one more secret, smaller, and far less dramatic than a scrapped death theme, but strange enough on its own, tied to a background character whose whose entire name comes directly from a real person who worked alongside the show's other writers, given to him as a running joke by his own co-workers. Section 8. Neil Goldman, the nerd named after a real person. Neil Goldman does not get nearly as much screen time as any of the main Griffin family members, but he shows up often enough that longtime fans of the show recognize him immediately. He is the classic school nerd, the kind of character built to be teased and overlooked, usually appearing in scenes tied to Chris or to storylines set at school. He wears glasses, speaks with a certain kind of awkward confidence, and generally fits the exact image most people picture when they hear the word nerd used to describe a side character on a comedy show. Shows built around a large cast of high school and neighborhood characters almost always include someone playing this exact role, a familiar type audiences recognize instantly without needing much explanation, and Neil fills that role for Family Guy the same way similar characters fill it on countless other comedies. What most fans never learn is that his name did not come from a random choice made in a writer's meeting. It came directly from a real person who actually worked on the show. According to information about the show's production, the character Neil Goldman is named after one of the actual writers who worked on Family Guy. This is not a case of a writer choosing to name a character after himself as some kind of personal joke or tribute. According to the same information, the real Neil Goldman did not name the character after himself at all. Instead, it was the other writers in the room who decided to give this particular nerdy, awkward side character the same name as their coworker, treating it as a running joke built entirely around how they personally saw him. It is worth pointing out how different this is from the usual explanation most people would assume for a background character sharing a name with a real writer. Most viewers, if they ever stop to wonder about it at all, would probably guess that a writer named a character after himself out of simple vanity or convenience. The reality here runs in the opposite direction, a joke handed to someone by the people around him rather than something he chose for himself. This detail is worth sitting with for a moment because it says something honest and a little uncomfortable about how writers' rooms actually work behind the scenes. Television writing teams spend enormous amounts of time together, working long hours in small rooms, bouncing ideas off each other, and getting to know each other's personalities extremely well over months and years of working side by side. A group of people spending that much time together, day after day, week after week, inevitably starts to see each other in very specific, sometimes unflattering ways. The same way any close-knit group of coworkers eventually develops shared opinions and running jokes about one another. Inside jokes naturally develop in that kind of environment, the same way they develop among any group of people who spend that much time together. Sometimes those inside jokes stay contained within the room itself, mentioned only in conversation and never making it anywhere near the actual show. Other times, as apparently happened here, an inside joke about a real coworker ends up written directly into the show itself, given a name, a personality, and a place within the fictional world the writers are building. According to the information available about this specific case, the joke was built around how the other writers viewed the real Neil Goldman, apparently seeing him as exactly the kind of person who fits the nerd label being poked fun at here. The character on screen, with his glasses, his awkward mannerisms, and his general place near the bottom of the social ladder at Chris's school, is not simply a made-up type pulled from general nerd stereotypes seen across countless other shows and movies. He is instead a specific reflection of how a group of writers privately saw one particular member of their own team turned into a permanent, recurring character that has appeared across many episodes over the years. That distinction matters. A generic stereotype pulled from nowhere in particular carries no real weight behind it. A stereotype built specifically around one real, identifiable person, someone still sitting in the same writer's room contributing to the same scripts, carries a very different kind of weight once you actually stop to think about what that means for the person on the receiving end of the joke. This kind of detail is genuinely different from most of the origin stories covered so far in this video. Peter's voice traced back to a stranger, someone McFarlane and his friends knew only briefly during college, with no lasting connection to the show itself beyond that one borrowed voice. Chris's voice traced back to a fictional character from a completely separate movie. Quagmire's surname traced back to real-world naming patterns tied loosely to immigration history. Neil Goldman is different because the joke stayed entirely internal to the show's own production team. The person being referenced was not some outside figure encountered briefly and then forgotten. He was someone the writers worked with directly, someone who continued showing up to the same writer's room, working on the same episodes, likely fully aware that his own co-workers had decided to base a recurring nerd character on how they personally viewed him. It raises an interesting question worth considering, one that does not have a clear answer based on the information available. What must it actually feel like to work alongside a group of people who have collectively decided you remind them enough of an awkward, socially unsuccessful successful nerd character that they gave that character your exact name and kept using it episode after episode. Imagine sitting in a pitch meeting, watching a scene get written for a character who shares your exact name, knowing that everyone else in the room privately built that character around their own impression of you specifically. There is no way to know for certain how the real Neil Goldman personally felt about this, whether he found it funny, uncomfortable, flattering in some strange way, or simply took it in stride as one more piece of the constant joking that comes with working in a writer's room built around exactly this kind of humor. What can be said clearly is that the joke stuck. It did not stay contained to a single episode or a brief mention. The character Neil Goldman became a recurring, recognizable presence within the show's world, carrying the exact name of a real writer for as long as the character has continued appearing on screen. This detail also reveals something small but genuine about how Family Guy handles its own internal culture compared to how it presents itself to the public. The show is widely known for taking aim at celebrities, public figures, and other well-known targets through its constant stream of jokes and references. Far less attention gets paid to the fact that the writers occasionally turn that same instinct inward, aiming a piece of that humor at one of their own co-workers instead of an outside target. It suggests that inside the actual production of the show, the writers treated each other with roughly the same lack of restraint they applied to everything else being satirized on screen, willing to build a lasting joke around a real colleague sitting right there in the same room with them. A show known for showing no restraint toward outside public figures apparently did not draw a clear line between that kind of target and the people working alongside them every single day. There is also a broader pattern worth recognizing here, one that connects back to several other details already covered throughout this video. Peter's voice came from a real person outside the show. Chris's voice came from a fictional villain borrowed and reshaped through an actor's private choice. Quagmire's name traces back to real naming history and a friend's casual suggestion. Now, Neil Goldman shows that even a fairly minor recurring side character carries this same pattern, built directly from a real relationship happening behind the scenes rather than invented purely from imagination. Family Guy. Despite its reputation for wild, over-the-top humor built around exaggerated situations and constant cutaways, keeps returning to something surprisingly grounded underneath many of its characters. Real people, real voices, and real relationships quietly shaping decisions that most viewers would never guess had anything to do with anyone's actual life outside the show. Nearly every secret uncovered so far in this video traces back to some real person standing just behind the animation. Whether that person is a stranger from a college campus, an actor bringing a personal choice into an audition, or, in this case, a coworker sitting at the very same table where the character was actually written into existence. It also says something about how small, seemingly unimportant characters can end up carrying more hidden history than viewers usually assume. Someone watching an episode featuring Neil Goldman for the first time would have no reason to think twice about his name. It sounds like an ordinary name attached to an ordinary side character, no different from dozens of other minor names scattered throughout the show's many background figures. Only by learning where that name actually came from does the character take on a different kind of weight, a reminder that even the smallest, most easily overlooked details in a long-running show sometimes trace back to something surprisingly specific and surprisingly personal happening far away from the screen, inside a writer's room most viewers will never see or think about. It is easy to assume that only the biggest, most central characters carry any real history behind them, while smaller side characters exist purely as filler, generic types wheeled out whenever a scene needs an extra face. Neil Goldman quietly proves that assumption wrong, showing that even the most minor recurring characters can carry a genuinely personal story behind them if you know where to look. None of this changes how Neil Goldman functions within the actual show. He remains a background nerd character, appearing periodically in scenes tied to school life and to Chris's own struggles fitting in socially. But the next time his name comes up in an episode, there is now a quiet piece of context sitting behind it. A reminder that somewhere behind the scenes, a real person with that exact name spent years working alongside the writers responsible for building this character, likely aware the entire time that his own name and reputation among his co-workers had become a permanent, recurring joke built directly into one of the most watched animated shows on television. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is another piece still left to uncover, tied not to any single character living inside Quahog, but to the one real person whose own voice quietly holds this entire show together. A man who somehow ended up speaking for 4 different main characters at once, and who very nearly was not alive to see any of it happen at all. Section 9. Seth MacFarlane. 1 man, 4 main voices, and a missed flight. Every character covered so far in this video has carried its own separate secret, its own separate hidden history, tied to a different different piece of the show's production, but running underneath nearly all of them sits one single person, showing up again and again in ways that most casual viewers never fully connect. Seth MacFarlane is not just the creator of Family Guy, he is also the actual voice behind several of its most central characters. And behind that fact sits a story about his own life that has nothing to do with cartoons at all, tied to one of the most serious days in modern American history. Start with the simple version of what MacFarlane actually does on this show, because even the simple version is more demanding than most viewers ever stop to consider. MacFarlane personally provides the voice for Peter Griffin, Stewie Griffin, Brian Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire, four of the show's most frequently appearing characters, all coming out of the mouth of one single person. This is not a case of an actor voicing one main character and a handful of smaller background roles here and there. These are four of the most central, most consistently present characters across the entire history of the show, and all four voices belong to the same man. Think for a moment about how different these four voices actually sound from each other. Peter's voice is loud, a little nasal, filled with strange pauses and awkward rhythm, built originally from an impression of a real security guard MacFarlane knew during his college years. Stewie's voice is completely different, a sharp, upper-class British accent modeled after actor Rex Harrison's performance in the film My Fair Lady, delivered with confidence and precision that sounds nothing like Peter's slower, clumsier way of speaking. Brian's voice sits somewhere else entirely, calm, dry, and a little world-weary, closer to how an ordinary, mildly disappointed adult might speak in everyday conversation. Quagmire's voice pulls from yet another completely separate influence, styled after fast-talking radio announcers from the 1950s, delivered with a rapid, exaggerated rhythm unlike any of the other three voices MacFarlane performs. Four voices, four completely different accents, speeds, and personalities, all coming from the same set of vocal cords. What makes this even more demanding is that these characters do not simply appear in separate episodes, taking turns being the focus, while the others sit quietly in the background. They frequently appear together, in the same scenes, talking directly to each other, sometimes within the very same few seconds of dialogue. This means MacFarlane often has to shift rapidly between these four distinct voices while recording, jumping from Peter's clumsy delivery straight into Stewie's clipped English precision, then into Brian's flatter, more measured tone, sometimes without any real pause between lines. According to people who have discussed the show's production, this kind of rapid switching requires serious vocal control and flexibility, the sort of skill that most performers spend years developing, rather than something that comes naturally without practice. This detail alone would be enough to make MacFarlane's role in the show worth understanding more deeply than most casual fans probably do. Most viewers watching Family Guy likely assume, without ever really stopping to think about it, that each character is voiced by a separate actor, the same way most family sitcoms with human actors would obviously involve completely separate people playing each family member. Learning that four of the show's most important characters all come from one single person changes how the entire show feels once you know it, especially during scenes where several of MacFarlane's characters end up talking to each other directly, essentially having him perform both sides of an entire conversation by himself, switching identities several times within a single scene. There is also a detail worth mentioning about how this affects live performances and public appearances tied to the show. Whenever MacFarlane appears somewhere in public and performs these characters live, whether during an interview, a convention appearance, or some other kind of event, he has to recreate this same rapid switching without the benefit of editing or separate recording sessions that studio work usually allows. Doing these voices back to back in front of a live audience, with no chance to stop, adjust, or redo a line that came out sounding too similar to a different character, represents a genuinely different kind of pressure compared to controlled studio recording, and it speaks to just how thoroughly MacFarlane has internalized these four distinct vocal identities after so many years of performing them. Now, step away from the show itself and look at something entirely separate from Family Guy, something tied directly to MacFarlane's own personal life, rather than his work as a voice actor or creator. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, one of the most devastating days in modern American history, Seth MacFarlane was originally scheduled to travel on American Airlines Flight 11. This is the same flight that was hijacked that morning and crashed into the World Trade Center, one of the attacks that killed thousands of people and reshaped the world in ways that are still felt today. MacFarlane was not supposed to miss that flight. He had a ticket. He was meant to be on board that specific plane on that specific morning. According to accounts of what happened, the reason he ended up missing it came down to a combination of small, ordinary circumstances rather than anything dramatic or unusual. He had been drinking the night before, leading to him oversleeping the following morning. On top of that, there was also a mix-up involving his travel agent, some kind of scheduling error that added further confusion to an already difficult morning. Between the late start caused by his hangover and the travel agent's mistake, McFarlane ended up rushing to the airport, arriving only minutes too late to actually board the flight he was originally scheduled to be on. It is difficult to fully sit with how close this actually was. This was not a situation where McFarlane changed his travel plans well ahead of time for some unrelated reason, deciding days earlier to take a different flight or travel on a different date. This was a genuinely narrow miss, arriving at the airport only minutes after the flight had already closed for boarding, caused by nothing more dramatic than a rough morning after a night of drinking, combined with an unrelated scheduling mistake made by someone handling his travel arrangements. Had either of those two small things gone differently, had he woken up on time, or had the travel agent not made that particular mistake, McFarlane would very likely have been on that specific flight that morning. This detail sits completely outside the world of Family Guy, unrelated to any character, any voice, or any storyline from the show itself. But it belongs in any honest look at the man behind so much of what makes the show what it is, because it represents something genuinely serious, sitting quietly behind someone whose public identity is built almost entirely around comedy, cartoon voices, and a show known for pushing boundaries and making people laugh. The same person responsible for 4 of Family Guy's most central voices came within minutes of being on one of the planes involved in one of the most tragic events in recent American history, saved not by careful planning or deliberate caution, but by an ordinary hangover and an unrelated travel mistake lining up together at exactly the right moment. It is worth thinking about how differently everything connected to this show might look today had those small circumstances not lined up the way they did. Family Guy had already aired for a few seasons by 2001, but its long-term future was still very much undecided at that point in its history, especially given how close the show itself came to permanent cancellation more than once during its early years. If McFarlane had been on that flight, the show almost certainly would have ended immediately, cutting short a series that would go on to run for well over 20 years and become one of the most recognized animated comedies in television history. 4 of its most central voices, Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire, exist today only because one man managed to miss a single flight on one specific morning, through nothing more dramatic than drinking too much the night before and a travel agent making an unrelated mistake. This detail also adds an unusual kind of weight to everything else covered throughout this video. Peter's voice, built from a private joke about a real security guard from McFarlane's college years, exists today because the person doing that voice happened to survive a morning that killed thousands of people through pure chance, rather than any deliberate decision on his part. Stewie's voice, built from an old admiration for Rex Harrison's performance in a decades-old musical film, exists for the exact same reason. So does Brian's calm, dry delivery, and so does Quagmire's rapid, radio-inspired rhythm. Every single one of these voices, each with its own separate, carefully traced origin story, ultimately depends on this one single morning going the way it did, on a hangover and a scheduling mistake happening to line up in McFarlane's favor rather than against him. There is something worth sitting with in how quietly this fact tends to sit alongside everything else people know about McFarlane and his work. Conversations about Family Guy tend to focus heavily on the show's humor, its willingness to push boundaries, its long-running characters, and its many recurring jokes and running gags built up across 2 decades of episodes. This single piece of McFarlane's personal history rarely comes up in those same conversations, even though it represents something genuinely significant sitting behind the entire show's continued existence. It is not the kind of detail that fits naturally into casual discussion about which episode is someone's favorite or which character delivers the best lines. It sits instead in a completely different category, tied to real tragedy and real chance, rather than anything related to comedy or entertainment at all. Taking a step back, this piece of McFarlane's own history connects in an unexpected way to something already covered earlier in this video, tied to Stewie's unaired storyline about his identity. Both stories involve something that could have gone completely differently based on circumstances outside anyone's direct creative control. The finished episode about Stewie coming out never aired because the show was canceled at a specific, unlucky moment in its history, a business decision completely separate from the quality or content of the episode itself. McFarlane's continued presence behind the microphone for Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire exists only because of an unrelated personal circumstance on one specific morning, completely separate from anything tied to the show's writing or production. Both stories show how much of this show's history, in ways most fans never think to consider, actually depends on circumstances that had nothing to do with creative decisions at all, shaped instead by timing, luck, and events completely outside anyone's control. None of this changes how audiences experience the show today. Peter still stumbles through each episode with the same clumsy energy he has carried since the very beginning. Stewie still delivers his lines with that same sharp, confident British accent. Brian still offers his dry dry, understated commentary on everything happening around him. Quagmire still talks in that same rapid, old-fashioned radio style that has defined him since his earliest appearances. But knowing what almost happened on that one specific morning in September of 2001 adds a quiet, serious weight sitting underneath every single one of those four voices. A reminder that the entire foundation of one of television's longest-running animated comedies came within minutes of never existing in its current form at all. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one final piece still worth understanding before this journey through Family Guy's hidden secrets comes to a close, tied not to any single voice or any single character, but to how differently this entire show might have looked from the very beginning. Built around a completely different network, in a completely different format, had one single early decision gone another way. Section 10. The show that almost started as something completely different. This final piece pulls back further, away from any single character, and looks instead at how the entire show almost never existed in the form fans know today. Built around a completely different plan that fell apart and came together more than once before Family Guy actually made it to television. The earliest version of what would eventually become Family Guy did not begin as a full-length animated sitcom at all. According to McFarlane's own account, given in an interview years later, Family Guy was originally meant to be a series of short animated segments airing as part of Mad TV, a sketch comedy show that was already running on Fox at the time. This idea followed a pattern that had worked before in television history, where a full-length animated show grows out of short segments originally created for a completely different program. The most well-known example of this pattern is The Simpsons, which began as a series of short segments on The Tracy Ullman Show before eventually becoming its own full-length series. McFarlane's original plan for Family Guy followed that same basic structure, imagining his characters appearing briefly within another show rather than headlining their own separate series from the very beginning. According to McFarlane, this plan for short segments on Mad TV did not work out, and the reason came down to something simple and practical rather than any creative disagreement. Speaking about this decision, McFarlane explained that it came down to a budgetary issue, since Fox did not have the budget available at that time to fund any kind of animation work for the Mad TV format he had originally proposed. Animation, even in short segments, requires a specific kind of production budget separate from what a live-action sketch show typically needs, and Fox was apparently not prepared to commit that kind of money toward the idea at the stage McFarlane first brought it to them. This detail alone reshapes how people should think about Family Guy's earliest beginnings. The show did not arrive already planned as a full-length series from the very start. It began as a much smaller, more limited idea, one that fell apart almost immediately due to nothing more dramatic than a lack of available funding at Fox during that specific period. Had the network had a slightly larger budget available at that moment, Family Guy might have begun its life as a series of brief animated bits tucked inside a completely different show, closer in spirit to a supporting feature than the standalone series it eventually became. The story does not end there, because McFarlane did not simply drop the idea once this first plan failed. According to reporting on the show's development history, McFarlane created an animated short during his time as a student, one that eventually caught the attention of Fox executives directly. When Fox saw this student work, rather than moving forward with the original plan for short inserts within another show, the network made a different decision entirely. According to reporting on this moment, Fox scrapped the earlier idea of using the material as short inserts and instead ordered Family Guy to be developed as its own full series from the very beginning. This is a meaningful shift worth sitting with. The original plan, brief animated segments folded into an already existing sketch show, was abandoned completely in favor of something far bigger, an entire standalone series built around these same characters and this same basic creative sensibility. Rather than becoming a supporting feature squeezed into someone else's show, Family Guy was elevated directly into its own dedicated series, skipping over the smaller format McFarlane had originally imagined for it. Timing played its own separate role in how this all eventually came together, tied closely to another show entirely unrelated to Family Guy on the surface. According to reporting on this period, McFarlane originally pitched his idea to Fox around the same time that a different creator, Mike Judge, was finalizing a deal for his own animated show, King of the Hill. Fox, already committing to that separate animated project, was hesitant at that moment to take on a second new animated comedy so close behind it, and passed on McFarlane's pitch the first time he brought it to them. Most people, faced with a direct rejection like that from a major television network, would likely move on entirely, treating the idea as something that simply did not work out. McFarlane did not do that. According to reporting on this same period, roughly 1 year after that initial rejection, McFarlane returned to Fox and pitched the idea again. By that point, King of the Hill had already become successful enough on air that Fox's overall confidence in animated comedy as a viable format format had grown considerably. With that shift in confidence, Fox agreed to give MacFarlane a chance, providing him with a budget of $50,000 specifically to produce a pilot episode built around his characters and ideas. This detail matters because it shows just how narrow the path to Family Guy's existence actually was. The show was rejected once, tied directly to unrelated hesitation caused by a completely different program airing on the same network. Only a full year later, after a separate show had proven itself successful enough to shift Fox's overall willingness to take a chance on animated comedy again, did MacFarlane get the opportunity to try again, and even then, only with a modest $50,000 budget to prove that his idea could actually work as a full pilot. It is worth imagining how differently things might have gone if MacFarlane had not returned a year later, or if King of the Hill had performed poorly enough during that same period to leave Fox unwilling to take another chance on a similar kind of show. Family Guy, as it exists today, one of the longest-running and most recognized animated comedies in American television history, depended entirely on this specific sequence of events lining up correctly. A first rejection tied to unrelated timing, a full year passing before a second attempt, another show's unrelated success shifting the network's confidence just enough to say yes the second time around, and a modest budget handed over on the strength of that shifted confidence, enough to produce a single pilot that would eventually grow into more than 20 years of television. This pilot, once completed and shown to Fox, became the foundation for everything that followed, though it is worth remembering that even this pilot itself carried an earlier, rougher version of several characters covered throughout this video. Lois appeared with blonde hair rather than the red hair fans know today. The overall tone and specific jokes within that early pilot differed in various ways from what the show eventually settled into once it moved from a single test episode into an ongoing weekly series. Family Guy, as fans recognize it today, did not fully exist yet, even once this pilot was greenlit. It still had further changes ahead of it before becoming the show that would eventually run for well over 2 decades. There is a broader lesson sitting inside this entire origin story, one that connects back to nearly everything already covered throughout this video. Every single character explored in this look at Family Guy's hidden history carries some kind of story about chance, timing, or circumstances completely outside anyone's careful planning. Peter's voice came from a private joke about a stranger from MacFarlane's college years. Chris's voice came from a bold, unplanned choice made during a single audition. Stewie's identity storyline depended on a specific creative plan interrupted by an unrelated business decision. MacFarlane's continued presence behind the microphone for 4 of the show's main characters depended on an unrelated personal circumstance on one specific tragic morning. And now, even the show's very existence as a standalone series rather than a set of short segments folded into someone else's program depended on a budget shortfall at exactly the wrong moment, followed by a completely unrelated show's success shifting Fox's confidence just enough to say yes the second time MacFarlane came knocking. None of these things happened because of careful, guaranteed planning. Each one depended on a specific set of circumstances lining up in a particular way, any one of which could easily have gone differently. A slightly bigger animation budget at Fox during that first pitch, a slightly less successful run for King of the Hill, a slightly different outcome on one specific morning in September of 2001, a different friend making a different dare during one specific audition. Any single one of these small, seemingly unrelated details, shifting even slightly, could have meant that Family Guy, in the form fans have known for more than 20 years now, never came together the way it actually did. This is worth sitting with as this whole exploration comes to a close. A show built around a fictional family living in a fictional town, filled with jokes, cutaways, and constant chaos, actually rests on a surprisingly fragile foundation made up of real coincidences, real near misses, and real decisions made by real people working under ordinary, sometimes difficult circumstances. Peter Griffin's voice exists because of a security guard nobody outside a small group of college friends ever thought about twice. Stewie's accent exists because of an old admiration for a decades-old musical performance. Chris's voice exists because of a dare between friends fooling around one evening. Quagmire's name exists because of a suggestion from an old college acquaintance. Neil Goldman exists because a group of writers decided to poke fun at a real coworker sitting in the same room with them. Death almost defined the entire show before quietly fading into a background character instead. And the show itself very nearly began as nothing more than a handful of short segments squeezed into someone else's program, saved only by a lucky pivot after Fox happened to see a piece of MacFarlane's earlier student work. Every character in this family, every neighbor, every recurring figure walking through the streets of Quahog carries some version of this same pattern underneath their surface, built from real decisions, real people, and real circumstances that most viewers watching casually would never think to look for. Family Guy presents itself as loud, chaotic, and endlessly ridiculous. And on the surface, it absolutely is exactly that. But sitting quietly underneath all of that noise is a long, tangled history of near misses, private jokes, borrowed voices, and unfinished plans. Each one small on its own, yet together forming the entire foundation of one of the most recognized animated families in television history.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.